When the phone rang that Tuesday morning and I saw the unknown number on the screen, I almost didn't answer. I was tired of telemarketing calls and research, but something made me press the green button. The voice on the other end was kind, polite, but carried a weight that immediately alerted me. He introduced himself as Thomas, owner of Thompson's Jewelry on the town's main street, and said he needed to speak with me about a sensitive and urgent matter. My heart began to beat faster. I had no idea what a jeweler would want from me. I hadn't purchased anything recently, hadn't taken anything in for repairs. Thomas noticed my hesitation and quickly explained that it wasn't anything I'd done, but rather something involving a piece that had arrived at his store. A piece with my name engraved on it. He asked if I could come by the jewelry store that day because the situation was truly important. I agreed, with a lump in my throat I couldn't explain. I hung up the phone and stood there in the middle of my kitchen, trying to understand what could be happening. What piece of jewelry was this? What delicate situation? My mind raced, running through all the possibilities. Had someone found something I'd lost? But I hadn't lost anything. I looked at my left hand, where I always wore my wedding ring, but it wasn't there. It hadn't been there for 4 years, ever since Robert died. That ring was kept safe, in a special little box inside my dresser drawer, along with old letters, faded photos, and some jewelry I'd inherited from my mother. It was my little treasure trove of memories, things I rarely touched because it hurt too much, but it comforted me to know they were there, safe, preserved. I walked quickly up the stairs to my room, my heart now pounding wildly in my chest. I opened the dresser drawer, my hand trembling slightly. There was the navy blue velvet box, exactly where it had always been. I carefully picked it up and opened it. It was empty. Completely empty. I felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. No, that wasn't possible. I had seen the ring there. When was the last time? I tried to remember. A week ago. 2 weeks. I always looked at the drawer, saw the box, but I confess I didn't always open it. The presence of the box was enough for me. It reassured me to know the ring was inside. But now the box was empty, and a jeweler was calling me about a piece engraved with my name. The connection was too obvious to be coincidence. If you've made it this far, you probably recognize that family relationships aren't always as we imagine, right? Here on this channel, you'll find a safe space where real stories like mine are told without judgment. These stories will move you, make you reflect, and perhaps even help you better understand your own family experiences. Subscribe to the channel and be part of this community where every story matters and where you're always welcome. Now I'll tell you all the details of this experience that completely transformed my perception of family, trust, and love. Let me rewind a bit so you can understand the whole story. My name is Margaret Thompson, I'm 63 years old, and I live alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in Portland, Oregon. I was married to Robert Thompson for 32 wonderful years. We met in college. I was studying education and he was studying business. We fell in love instantly, in that intense, naive way only 20-year-olds can. We married in the summer of 1991. In a simple but beautiful ceremony in my parents' garden. I wore my mother's dress, altered, and Robert was so nervous he almost dropped the rings during the ceremony. Everyone laughed. It was a light and happy moment that set the tone for our marriage. The ring he placed on my finger that day was simple, a white gold band without many details. We didn't have much money at the time. We were just starting out, paying off student loans, living in a tiny apartment. But that ring represented everything to us. It was the symbol of the commitment we were making, of the life we were going to build together. Years later, when we'd been married 10 years and our financial situation had improved a bit, Robert surprised me. He took my ring without my knowledge, took it to a jeweler, and had our initials engraved on the inside, an R intertwined with an M, and set 3 small diamonds on the outside. They weren't large or expensive, but they were perfect. When he gave the ring back to me on our 10-year anniversary, I cried with emotion. That gesture, that attention to detail, that care in making something already special even more meaningful, was exactly who Robert was. We had a son, David, who was born 3 years after our wedding. The pregnancy was difficult, I had complications, and the doctors said it would be risky to try for more children. So David became our only child, our everything. I won't lie and say it was easy. Children don't come with an instruction manual, and we made our mistakes, as all parents do. But we loved that boy with every fiber of our being. Robert worked as a manager at a large hardware and construction supply store, a stable job that didn't pay a fortune. I was a third-grade elementary school teacher, teaching 8- and 9-year-olds to read, write, and love learning. It wasn't a high salary either, but it was rewarding. We lived modestly but comfortably. We bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood when David was 5. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a backyard where Robert put up a swing for David and planted roses I adored. That house became our sanctuary, the place where we created millions of memories. Birthdays, Christmases, Sunday dinners, board game nights. David grew up in that house. We watched him take his first steps in the hallway, learn to ride his bike without training wheels in the backyard, get ready for prom in the living room. Every corner of that house held a story, a memory, a piece of our lives. David was always a relatively easygoing boy. He wasn't perfect, he had his tantrums and difficult moments like any child, but overall, he was polite, did well in school, and had friends. We encouraged him to go to college, and he chose to study marketing. It wasn't the most practical or lucrative field, but it was what he enjoyed, and we supported him. During college, he met Jessica. She was in the same class, studying graphic design. When David brought her to meet us for the first time, I had mixed feelings. She was beautiful, there was no denying that. Blonde, blue eyes, the kind of beauty that commands attention. But there was something about the way she spoke, the way she carried herself, that bothered me. She seemed too focused on appearances, on brands, on status. During that first dinner at our house, she made several comments about the house being small but charming, about my clothes being vintage in a way that didn't sound like a compliment, about how admirable it was that I had managed to raise a family on a teacher's salary. Robert sensed my discomfort and talked to me after they left. He said maybe I was being too critical, that Jessica was young and perhaps just nervous about meeting her boyfriend's parents. I wanted to believe it, so I swallowed my reservations and decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. David seemed genuinely in love and happy, and that was all that mattered. They dated for 3 years before David told us he'd proposed to Jessica. She said yes, and they began planning the wedding. An expensive wedding, I might add. Jessica's father had some money and paid for most of it, but David still asked us for help. We contributed $5,000 from our savings. It wasn't spare money, it was a sacrifice, but it was our son's wedding. The wedding was in June 2015, a large elaborate ceremony in a chic hotel. Everything had to be perfect, from the decor to the menu, from Jessica's dress to the flowers. I wore a simple dress I bought on sale, and Robert rented a tuxedo. We felt a little out of place among all those well-dressed guests and all the ostentation, but we tried to enjoy it. It was our son's special day. Dovie was radiant and happy, and that made us happy too. During the reception, Jessica tossed the bouquet and gave a speech about how she'd found the perfect man who would give her the life of her dreams. I remember squeezing Robert's hand under the table, both of us thinking the same thing but saying nothing. In the early years of their marriage, everything seemed fine. David had landed a decent job at a marketing agency. Jessica worked as a freelance designer. They rented a small apartment in a good neighborhood. We visited regularly, always bringing home-cooked meals because I knew my son missed home-cooked meals. Jessica was polite to me, but there was always a certain coldness, a distance. She never invited me to coffee or shopping together, never seemed truly interested in building a mother-in-law relationship. I didn't force things, respected her space, and tried to be a positive presence without being intrusive. Then, in December of 2019, our lives changed forever. Robert began experiencing back pain, which he attributed to lifting something heavy at work. But the pain didn't improve, it worsened. After weeks of insistence, I finally convinced him to see a doctor. The tests revealed the worst possible news: advanced stage pancreatic cancer. The doctor was blunt with us, saying the prognosis wasn't good, that we could have a few months, maybe a year if he responded well to treatment. I felt my world crumble in that consulting room. Robert took my hand and squeezed, trying to be strong for me when I knew he was terrified inside. The following months were a nightmare. Chemotherapy, radiation, endless appointments, Robert growing weaker and thinner. I took time off work to care for him, to be by his side every second I could. David was wonderful during this time, I must admit. He came to visit us several times a week, helped with doctor's appointments, and stayed with his father so I could get some rest. Jessica came along sometimes, but usually stayed in the living room playing on her phone while David and I cared for Robert. I didn't judge her for this. I understood that she didn't know how to deal with illness and death, that it was uncomfortable for her. Robert fought with all his might, but the cancer was too aggressive. In August of 2020, he left us. He died at home, in our bed, holding my hand. His last words were telling me he loved me and asking me to take good care of David. I promised I would, that I would always be there for our son. He closed his eyes and passed away, peacefully, painlessly. The void left behind was immense, unbearable. 32 years by someone's side, building a life together, and suddenly you're alone. The house that was once full of life became silent and cold. Every corner held his presence. His favorite chair in the living room, his tools in the garage, his clothes in the closet. It took me months to donate his clothes, to rearrange the house in a way that wouldn't hurt so much. David remained attentive in the first few months after his father's death. He'd come visit me, check on me, make sure I was eating right, and making sure I wasn't becoming too isolated. But gradually, the visits became less frequent. He had his life, his work, his marriage. I understood. I didn't want to be a burden. So I started to come out of my shell more, returning to work after a few months, and trying to rebuild some kind of routine. But the nights were awful. I lay in bed alone, and Robert's absence was physical and painful. I cried myself to sleep many nights. It was about a year after Robert's death that I began to seriously consider selling the house. It was too big for me alone, filled with too many memories that were sometimes comforting but other times suffocating. I talked to David about the idea, and he agreed it made sense. He said it would be nice to have something smaller, more practical, and easier to maintain. So I put the house on the market in September of 2021. The real estate market was hot, and I received a good offer quickly. I sold the house for $320,000. After paying the remaining mortgage and sales fees, I was left with $230,000 net. I bought a 2-bedroom apartment in a modern building about 20 minutes from where I'd lived before. I paid $150,000 cash for the apartment. It was smaller, simpler, but comfortable. It had a small balcony where I'd planted a few plants, a functional kitchen, and most importantly, it didn't have the heavy memories of my old house. It was a fresh start. With the remaining $80,000, I opened a savings account. It was my emergency fund, my insurance for old age, for potential health problems, to provide some financial security for my remaining years. As a retired teacher, my pension wasn't generous. That money was essential for my peace of mind. I told David about the money because I've always been transparent with my son. I told him I had $80,000 saved and that I needed to keep that money intact for emergencies and my upcoming retirement. David seemed happy for me, saying it was great to have that security, that it was exactly what his father would have wanted. At the time, his reaction seemed genuine and appropriate. It didn't occur to me that this information would become a problem. The first requests for money began innocently and reasonably. David called me about 2 months after the house sale, saying his car had broken down and needed urgent repairs to get to work. He said he didn't have the money at the time because he'd just paid several bills and his credit card was maxed out. He asked if I could lend him $200. Of course, I said yes. He was my son, he was in an emergency, and I could help. I transferred the money immediately. He thanked me profusely and promised to return it with his next paycheck. His payment came and went, but the money wasn't returned. I didn't mind too much. It was only $200. A month later, another request. This time it was for $500. The energy bill had been very high because of the harsh winter, and they were having trouble paying. I transferred the money without question. Another month. Another request. The credit card bill was accruing interest, and they needed to pay at least the minimum to avoid damaging their reputation. $1,000 this time. I started to get a little worried and asked if everything was okay financially. David assured me that it was just a few difficult months, that everything would stabilize soon. I believed him because he was my son, and you want to believe that your son is telling the truth. The requests kept coming. Sometimes it was David who called, other times it was Jessica sending elaborate messages explaining the current emergency. Their roof was leaking and needed urgent repair, $3,000. Their car insurance had gone up, and they hadn't anticipated the cost, $800. Jessica had the opportunity to take a professional course important to her career, but it was expensive, $1,200. David needed to buy new clothes for work because he'd been promoted and needed to make a good impression, $600. Each request came with a detailed explanation, a justification that made sense on the surface. I always helped. I always transferred the money. Because he was my son, because he had been by my side when I lost Robert, because I had the capacity to help, and what kind of mother would I be if I denied my own son help when he needed it? But the money was never returned. When I mentioned the accumulated debts, David became defensive. He said he couldn't believe I was collecting debts for my own son, that families didn't do that a real mother helped without expecting anything in return. These words hurt me deeply. They made me feel guilty for even mentioning the money. So I stopped collecting and ended up forgiving the debt in my mind, convincing myself that my relationship with my son was more important than money. In 2 years, from October 2021 to October 2023, I had given David and Jessica $27,000. $27,000. My savings account, which had started with $80,000, now had $53,000. I was worried, starting to lose sleep over my financial future. But every time I decided I needed to say no to the next request, David would show up with another emergency that seemed too legitimate to deny. Then something happened that began to open my eyes. It was in April of 2024. I was casually browsing Instagram when I saw a post from Jessica. She was standing in front of an elegant and expensive restaurant in the city, wearing a dress that was clearly not cheap, and holding a bag I immediately recognized. It was a Louis Vuitton bag, one of those that cost a small fortune. I knew how much it cost because just 3 weeks earlier, Jessica had shown me that exact bag when we were at the mall together. She had sighed dramatically in front of the Louis Vuitton store window, pointed to that particular bag, and said it was her dream, that it cost $4,500 but that it was an investment because it held its value. I had commented about the price being absurd for a bag, and she had laughed in agreement, saying it was truly an impossible luxury for their budget at the time. But there she was, 3 weeks later, with that expensive bag. The photo caption read, "I finally realized my dream. Thank you my love for making me so happy," followed by several heart emojis. The comments were full of friends asking how she did it, praising her husband, telling her she deserved it. Jessica responded to each comment by saying that David had given her an incredible surprise, that he was the best husband in the world. I stared at that photo for long minutes, trying to understand. David had asked me for $3,000 just 5 weeks earlier. He said their roof had a serious leak discovered during a heavy rainstorm, and that if they didn't fix it quickly, the problem would worsen and the repairs would become even more expensive. He even showed photos of the ceiling with damp stains and the bucket on the floor collecting water. It seemed urgent and legitimate. I wired the $3,000 immediately. How then, just 5 weeks later, did he have the money to buy Jessica a $4,500 purse? I tried to rationalize. Maybe he'd gotten a bonus at work. Maybe he'd earned extra money somehow. Maybe the roof hadn't cost the full $3,000, and he'd used the remaining money, along with other savings, for his scholarship. But something didn't add up. The feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. I started paying more attention to Jessica's social media. I saw photos of her at fancy restaurants, wearing designer clothes, showing off expensive new home decor items. For someone who constantly needed to borrow money to pay basic bills, Jessica seemed to be living a fairly comfortable lifestyle. I decided I needed to talk to David about it. I didn't want to accuse him of anything, but I needed to understand their real financial situation. I arranged to meet him for lunch at a cafe we used to frequent when he was younger. During lunch, I tried to broach the subject delicately. I mentioned seeing the picture of the bag and commented that it must have been expensive. David got a bit defensive, saying he'd done some extra freelance work and used the money to make Jessica happy. I asked about the roof repair, and he assured me it had been done and looked great. I asked if things were improving financially since he'd been able to buy the bag. He said it was still difficult but that he was managing. Something about the way he spoke, looking away, quickly changing the subject, made me even more uncomfortable. But I didn't know what to do with that feeling. I had no proof of anything wrong, just a hunch. I decided I wouldn't lend money so easily anymore, that I would start asking more questions, demanding more justifications. It was a decision that didn't last long because just 2 weeks after that lunch, Jessica called me in tears. She said her mother was sick and needed surgery that her insurance didn't fully cover, that they needed $2,500 to cover the extra costs. How do you say no to something like that? I wired the money. Jessica thanked me in tears, saying I was a wonderful mother-in-law, that she would never forget my help. I later found out that Jessica's mother was perfectly fine. That tearful connection was all an act. But I only discovered that months later, when everything came to light. The day my life changed forever was an ordinary Tuesday in September 2024. I had woken up early, taken my morning walk in the park near my building, and had breakfast while reading the news on my tablet. It was a quiet morning, and I was planning to use the day to organize some closets and perhaps start reading a new book I had purchased. Then the phone rang, and it was Thomas from Thompson Jewelry. The conversation was brief. He didn't elaborate on the phone, simply saying he needed to speak with me in person about something important related to a piece of jewelry. I agreed to go to the jewelry store that afternoon. After hanging up the phone, I went to check my drawer and discovered the empty box. My heart raced. My hands began to tremble. Robert's ring was gone. Someone had taken it. But who? I lived alone. I didn't have any cleaning or maintenance staff who came into my apartment regularly. The only people who had a key to my apartment besides me were the building manager and David. David had a spare key for emergencies. I had given it to him when I first moved in. No, it couldn't be David. My son would never do something like that. But who else could it have been? I went to the jewelry store at 2 in the afternoon. The place was elegant, traditional, with display cases full of beautiful jewelry and an interior that smelled of wood polish and something faintly floral. Thomas was a distinguished gentleman, with completely gray hair, gold-rimmed glasses, and large hands but delicate movements. He greeted me warmly but with a seriousness that indicated the gravity of the situation. He led me to a private room in the back and offered me water, coffee, and tea. I accepted water because my throat was dry. Then he placed a small black velvet box on the table between us. He opened the box slowly, almost ceremonially. Inside was my wedding ring. I recognized it instantly. How could I not? That ring had been on my finger for 32 years. I knew every mark, every imperfection, every detail. The 3 small diamonds Robert had set, the initials R and M intertwined on the inside. My hand automatically reached out to touch the jewel, as if needing confirmation that it was real, that it was truly there in front of me. Thomas watched my reaction silently, giving me time to process. When I finally looked at him, my eyes were already brimming with tears. He began to explain. A young man had come to the store 3 weeks earlier, on August 23rd, a Friday morning. The man said he needed to sell his ring, a family heirloom, but he was experiencing urgent financial difficulties. Thomas regularly bought used jewelry. It was part of his business, but he was always very careful about the provenance of his pieces. He had been scammed in the past, had unknowingly purchased stolen items, and since then had kept meticulous records of every transaction. He always photographed the seller's ID, wrote down contact information, and examined the pieces carefully. When he examined the ring, Thomas immediately realized it was a special piece. The diamonds were small but of good quality, the gold was pure, and there were those initials engraved inside. Something about the situation bothered him. The man was too eager to sell, accepting the offered price without negotiating, which was unusual. Thomas offered $1,800 for the piece, and the man accepted immediately, almost with relief. The transaction was completed. Thomas paid in cash, photographed the seller's ID, and recorded everything in his system. But that sale continued to bother Thomas. He had decades of experience and developed a sort of sixth sense for suspicious situations. A few days later, in a moment of curiosity or perhaps intuition, he decided to investigate a little. He looked again at the engraved initials, R and M. He searched the city's death records, a move that might seem morbid but one that Thomas sometimes did when he suspected a piece of jewelry might have questionable origins. He found the obituary of Robert Mitchell, who died in August 2020. The obituary mentioned that he was survived by his wife, Margaret Mitchell. The initials made sense. Robert and Margaret. Thomas then did something that went beyond his duties as a merchant. He searched my name in public records, found my address and phone number, and decided to contact me. He said that in 40 years of operating that jewelry store, he had seen many sad situations, had seen families destroyed by greed, had seen people sell precious heirlooms out of desperation or addiction. But something about that particular situation touched his heart in a special way. Perhaps because he had lost his own wife a few years earlier and understood the sentimental value of a wedding ring. Perhaps because something in the salesman's anxiety raised red flags he couldn't ignore. I asked with a trembling voice if he could show me who had sold the ring. Thomas turned the computer monitor toward me and opened the transaction file. There was the photo of the ID. It was David. My son David. There was no mistake. It was clearly him, that face I knew so well, those eyes that were a mix of mine and Robert's. The date of birth, the address, everything was his. David had sold his own father's wedding ring. The shock was so great that for a moment I couldn't breathe. It felt like I'd been physically punched in the gut. Tears began streaming down my face uncontrollably. Thomas quickly offered me tissues, placing his hand on my shoulder in a gesture of comfort. He waited patiently as I cried, as I tried to process this incomprehensible betrayal. How? Why? How had my son, my only son, become capable of such a thing? When I finally managed to speak, I asked how much I needed to pay to get my ring back. Thomas shook his head firmly. He said he didn't want a cent. That ring was obviously mine. It had been taken from me without my consent. He couldn't in good conscience make me pay for something that was rightfully mine. He took the ring from the box and placed it in my hand, closing my fingers around it. That gesture of kindness from a complete stranger, when my own blood had betrayed me so deeply, made me cry even harder. I stayed in that jewelry store for almost 2 hours. Thomas brought tea, sat with me, listened as I told him about Robert, about our marriage, about how that ring was the last physical connection I had with the love of my life. He shared his own stories of loss, offering me not only the ring back but also his empathy and understanding. Before I left, Thomas gave me copies of all the transaction documentation. He told me I should consider taking legal action, that what David had done was technically theft, and that I had every right to sue him. I thanked him profusely, took all the documents, put the ring back on my finger for the first time in 4 years, and left that jewelry store with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and a deep ache in my heart. In the car, sitting in the parking lot, I looked at the ring on my finger. The sunlight hit the small diamonds, making them sparkle. I touched the initials engraved on the inside, tracing with my finger that are intertwined with M, Robert. My Robert. How many times had he held my hand and touched that ring? How many times had he absent-mindedly played with it while we watched TV together on the couch? That ring had been on my finger through every important moment of our lives together. At David's birth, at graduations, on birthdays, on trips, in the happy times and the difficult ones. And David had taken it and sold it as if it were just a worthless, meaningless object. I drove home on autopilot, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. When I got to the apartment, I went straight to my room and started reviewing everything in my mind. When was the last time I'd seen the ring box? It had been about 3 weeks earlier, when I'd taken some old photos out of the drawer. I clearly remembered seeing the little blue box there, but I hadn't opened it. So David must have picked up the ring between then and 3 weeks ago, because the jewelry store's sale date was August 23rd. I started thinking about all the recent times David had been to my apartment. He'd come to visit me in late July, but I'd been there the entire time. Then he came again in mid-August, on the 14th, if I remembered correctly, a Saturday. I remembered because we'd had lunch together and watched a movie. I'd been there the whole time. He hadn't been alone in my room. But then I remembered another day. August 18th, a Wednesday. I was getting ready to go out, meeting some friends for dinner. I'd just gotten out of the shower when David called to say he was in the neighborhood and would be stopping by quickly to pick up a book he'd forgotten on his last visit. I told him I'd be out in a few minutes but that he could use his key to get in. I hung up the phone and continued getting ready in the bathroom. I heard the door open and close, heard David shout a quick hello, and a few minutes later I heard the door again. He shouted goodbye and that he'd already picked up the book. I shouted back goodbye. The entire visit lasted no more than 5 minutes and he didn't even come into my room, or at least that's what I assumed. But thinking back, I was in the bathroom with the door closed and the hairdryer running most of the time. I couldn't see what David was doing. He could easily have entered my room, opened my drawer, taken the ring from the box, and left without me noticing at all. His move was genius in a sick way. He made an excuse to come to the apartment when he knew I would be distracted getting ready. He didn't stay long enough to arouse suspicion. He just took the ring, leaving the box in the drawer so I wouldn't notice it was missing immediately. It was premeditated, planned, calculated. I sat on the bed and let the realization wash over me in waves. My son hadn't taken the ring in a moment of weakness or desperation. He'd planned the robbery. He'd waited for the right opportunity. He'd executed the plan carefully. And then he'd sold the ring and used the money to buy Jessica a designer handbag. Because now it all made sense. The $1,800 Thomas had paid for the ring plus the $3,000 David had borrowed a few weeks earlier for the supposed roof repair came to exactly $4,800. Enough to buy that damned Louis Vuitton bag. The roof had never needed repair. The photos David showed me were probably from some random place he found on the internet. That whole story was a lie just to get more money to buy the purse. And when the money he got from me wasn't enough, he simply broke into my house and stole the most precious thing I had. It wasn't just the theft of the ring. It was the theft of years of trust. It was proof that the $27,000 I had given them had probably not been used for real emergencies, but rather to support a lifestyle they couldn't afford. It was the revelation that my son had become someone I didn't know or recognize. I spent the rest of that day and the entire night in a state of shock and grief. I didn't eat anything, I couldn't. I just sat staring at the ring on my finger, replaying years of memories, trying to understand where I'd gone wrong as a mother, how I'd raised a son capable of doing this. Had I been too permissive? Too protective? Had I failed to instill the right values? Robert had always been a present, loving, yet firm father. We tried to teach David about honesty, respect, and empathy. But clearly something had gone wrong. Or perhaps Jessica had changed him in ways I couldn't have foreseen or prevented. The next morning, I made a decision. I needed to confront David, but I didn't want to do it impulsively or emotionally. I needed to be calm, rational, and in control. I waited until Friday and then called David. I said I needed to talk to him about something important and asked him to come visit me alone on Saturday morning. He asked what it was, and I told him it needed to be in person. I heard a hesitation in his voice, but he agreed to come at 10 in the morning. Friday night and all of Saturday morning were torture. I mentally rehearsed what I was going to say 1,000 times. How would I start the conversation? How would I react to his apology? What would I do next? I barely slept that night. I lay staring at the ceiling, my ring clutched tightly on my finger, Robert so present in my thoughts I could almost feel him there with me. I so wanted to talk to him, ask him what to do, hear his opinion. Robert was always firmer than I was with David, but at the same time deeply loving. He would know what to do. Saturday morning, 10 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. I opened the door and there was David, smiling, holding a coffee from my favorite coffee shop. My heart sank. That gesture, which would otherwise have been affectionate, now seemed false, manipulative. He came in, kissed me on the cheek, and began talking animatedly about the weather, about his week at work. I let him talk, made coffee, and we sat in the living room. He continued talking, completely at ease, without any visible signs of guilt or nervousness. This almost hurt me even more. How could he just stand there, acting as if nothing had happened? How did he sleep at night knowing what he'd done? When he finally paused in the conversation and took a sip of coffee, I decided it was time. I placed my left hand on the table, in the light streaming through the window. The ring glinted. David glanced at my hand casually first, then his eyes focused on the ring and froze. I saw the exact moment he registered what he was seeing. His expression changed completely. The color literally drained. Or his face. His eyes widened. His hand shook, making the coffee cup wobble. He knew. He knew I knew. I asked with a calm I hadn't known I possessed, how he imagined I wouldn't find out. David began to stutter. He tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come out coherently. I waited in silence, letting the discomfort grow. Finally, he managed to formulate a sentence, saying he didn't know what I was talking about. I responded by methodically recounting the whole story. The call from Thomas at Thompson Jewelry. The visit to the store. The discovery of the ring. The complete documentation of the transaction, including the photo of his ID. The dates that matched perfectly. As I spoke, David sank deeper and deeper into his chair, as if he were physically shrinking. He initially tried to deny it, saying there must have been a mistake, that perhaps someone had stolen his identity. I grabbed the folder beside me and placed it on the table. I opened it and showed him all the copies Thomas had given me. The ID, the transaction receipt, everything. There was no denying it. The evidence was there, black and white. David was silent for long moments, staring at the papers as if they might somehow change or disappear. Then he changed strategy. The excuses started pouring in. Jessica was obsessed with that bag. All her friends had designer bags, and she felt inferior. She was threatening to leave him if he couldn't give her the things she wanted. He was desperate. He didn't know what to do. He saw the ring and thought I wasn't even wearing it, that it was just sitting there for no purpose. He would buy it back when he had the money. It was a moment of madness. He deeply regretted it. I listened in silence and then asked if he really thought those excuses made any difference. I asked if he really expected me to believe that stealing his dead father's wedding ring to buy a handbag to impress his wife's friends was somehow justifiable. I asked how he thought his father would feel knowing what he had done. David began to cry. Real tears streaming down his face. He said he knew he had done something terrible, that there was no excuse, that he would live with this guilt for the rest of his life. But I wasn't finished. I grabbed a second folder and placed it on the table. This one contained a document I'd prepared the previous few days. It was a detailed spreadsheet of every penny I'd lent David and Jessica over the past 2.5 years. $27,000 distributed across 17 different transactions. Each documented with the date, amount, and reason given. Car repairs, overdue bills, Jessica's college tuition, leaking roof, and so on. I pushed the spreadsheet toward David and told him to read it. He read, and with each line, I could see him sinking deeper. When he finished, I asked how many of those emergencies were real. He didn't answer. I pressed the question. Finally, quietly, he admitted that most weren't real. They weren't genuine emergencies. They were excuses to raise money to maintain a standard of living they couldn't afford. Expensive dinners, designer clothes, home decor, weekend getaways. Jessica had high standards, and he felt he had to meet them. My voice came out louder than I intended when I asked why the hell he didn't just say no to her. Why he didn't explain that they couldn't afford such things. Why he had to steal from his own mother to satisfy the whims of a materialistic woman. David said I didn't understand, that Jessica came from a wealthy family, that she was accustomed to a certain lifestyle, that she constantly compared him to her friends' husbands. He felt inadequate, a failure as a provider. He just wanted to make her happy. I stared at my son, this 33-year-old man sitting across from me, his face red from crying, and felt something break inside me. It wasn't just my heart, it was the image I had of him. The sweet boy I had raised, who played with trucks in the yard, who gave me drawings he'd made at school, who hugged me when he was sad. This man wasn't that boy. Or maybe he was, and I'd simply never seen him clearly for who he truly was. Maybe I'd raised a son who valued external approval above integrity. A son who sacrificed the people who loved him to impress those who didn't matter. I told David I wanted my apartment key back. Immediately. He started to protest, saying that if I had an emergency, who would help me? I replied that I'd rather die alone in an emergency than have a son who used my access to my house to rob me. The words came out harsher than I intended, but they were true. David took the key off his keychain with trembling hands and handed it to me. I put the key in my pocket. I then told him he had 30 days to pay me back at least $10,000 of the $27,000. He tried to argue that it was impossible, that he didn't have that kind of money. I told him that was his problem. I suggested Jessica sell the Louis Vuitton bag or perhaps some of the other expensive things they had bought with my money. I told him it was no longer my responsibility to finance a lifestyle they clearly couldn't afford. And that if he didn't pay the $10,000 within 30 days, I would consult a lawyer about my legal options. David looked at me in disbelief. He said I wouldn't do that I was his son, that family doesn't sue family. I replied that family doesn't steal from family, but he had done exactly that. He told me I was serious and that he needed to understand the gravity of the situation. He had betrayed my trust in the worst possible way. He had robbed me financially for years. He had violated my privacy. He had sold an irreplaceable inheritance. And he had done all this while pretending to love and care about me. David left my apartment that day completely devastated. I felt devastated too, but there was a strange sense of relief too. I had finally said everything I needed to say. I had finally set boundaries. I had finally stopped letting myself be exploited. It wasn't a good feeling, but it was necessary. The following days were filled with calls and messages that I mostly ignored. David called repeatedly, sending long messages alternating between apologies, justifications, and accusations that I was being cruel. Jessica also contacted me, but her approach was completely different. She didn't apologize. She called me screaming, calling me a controlling mother who used money to manipulate her son. She said I was destroying their marriage. She said the ring was just an old piece of jewelry I wasn't even wearing, kept for no purpose while she needed that bag for her self-esteem and professional image. She said I was selfish for making such a fuss over an object. Her words shocked me so much that for a moment I was speechless. Then something inside me hardened. I told Jessica, with an icy calm I didn't know I possessed, that ring represented 32 years of the best marriage anyone could have. It represented the man I loved more than anything in the world. It represented a life built together, memories that were sacred to me. And that if she thought a handbag to impress superficial friends was more important than that, then she was even more pathetic than I realized. I hung up on her and blocked her number immediately. The 30 days passed, and David didn't show up with the $10,000. He called on the 29th day asking for more time, saying he'd been trying to get a loan but it was proving difficult. I told him no, that he'd had enough time, and that I would seek legal counsel. The next day, I scheduled an appointment with the most respected law firm in the city. The lawyer who saw me was a middle-aged man named Richard Stromberg, with decades of experience in family disputes and financial fraud cases. I told Richard the whole story and showed him all the documentation. He listened attentively, asked specific questions, and examined each document carefully. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and gave me his professional assessment. Legally, I had a solid case. David had technically committed theft by taking the ring without my consent. I had irrefutable photographic and documentary evidence. As for the money I had lent, it would be more difficult to recover unless I had formal written agreements for the loans, but there were still options. Richard was very straightforward with me about the consequences. If I prosecuted David for the theft of the ring, he could face serious charges. It could give him a criminal record, it could affect his employment, and it could completely destroy any chance of family reconciliation in the future. It was a decision I needed to consider carefully. As for the money, we could send a formal letter of legal demand, setting out a payment plan and making it clear that failure to comply would result in legal action. This was usually enough to make people take the situation seriously. I thought long and hard about my options over the next few weeks. Part of me wanted to prosecute David. I wanted him to face real consequences for what he had done. I wanted him to understand that actions have repercussions. But another part of me, the part that was still a mother despite everything, couldn't do it. I couldn't be responsible for my son having a criminal record, for potentially ruining his career and life. So I decided not to prosecute him, but to make it absolutely clear that I expected restitution and that there were consequences for his actions. I worked with Richard to draft a formal demand letter. The letter stated that David owed me $27,000 for the unpaid loans plus $1,800 that the jeweler had paid for the ring, for a total of $28,800. The letter proposed a payment plan of $600 per month for the next 4 years, which would give them time to reorganize their finances but also ensure that I would be repaid. The letter made it very clear that failure to comply with the payment plan would result in immediate legal action. Along with the demand letter, I made another important decision. I scheduled a meeting with my financial planner and estate attorney to change my will. Until then, David was my sole heir, which meant that upon my death, he would inherit everything I owned, including the remainder of my savings, my apartment, and my pension. I changed that completely. I divided my assets among 3 charities that work with elderly victims of family financial abuse, a problem I now understood to be much more common than people realize. David would not inherit a single penny. The letter informing me of the change in will was sent along with the demand letter. The reaction was immediate and explosive. David called me screaming, angrier than I'd ever seen him. How could I do this to him? How could I disinherit him? I was his mother. Family didn't do that. I was putting money above maternal love. Jessica posted vague but clearly directed posts on social media about toxic mothers who can't let their adult children live their lives, about people who use money as a weapon of control, about how lucky she was to have a real family who supported her. I blocked Jessica on all social media. I blocked her phone number too. As for David, I didn't block his number because we needed to maintain some line of communication for the payment plan, but I made it clear that I would only respond to messages related to the payments. Anything else would be ignored. I told him that his actions had consequences, and these were the consequences. If he wanted any chance of rebuilding a relationship with me in the future, he needed to start by honoring the payment agreement and demonstrating real change through actions, not words. The first few months were almost completely silent between us. But curiously, on the 10th of each month, a deposit of $600 would appear in my account. No message accompanied the deposits, no contact information, just the money. He was paying. Whether it was out of fear of legal consequences or if some remnant of conscience had finally awakened in him, I didn't know. But he was paying. During this period of separation, I began therapy. My family doctor recommended a therapist specializing in family trauma and financial abuse. Her name was Dr. Sarah Chen, an Asian American woman in her early 40s with a calm but firm presence. The first few sessions were difficult. I cried a lot, processing not only David's betrayal but also my own guilt for having allowed it to happen for so long. Dr. Chen helped me understand that what I had experienced was a classic pattern of family financial abuse. Much more common than most people realize, but rarely discussed because victims feel shame. She taught me about healthy boundaries, about the difference between helping someone and enabling destructive behavior, about how true love sometimes means saying no. She helped me see that I hadn't done anything wrong by confronting David and establishing consequences. That being a mother doesn't mean being an infinite resource to be exploited. That I had value regardless of my usefulness to others. These were hard lessons to absorb after decades of believing my role was to always put my son's needs before my own. I also began reconnecting with parts of my life I'd neglected. I had friends from my teaching days whom I'd seen less and less in recent years because I was always available when David needed something. I reconnected with them, started going out for lunch and coffee, and rekindled friendships that had fallen by the wayside. I joined a book club at the local library. I started watercolor classes, something I'd always wanted to do but never prioritized. I traveled to Seattle to visit a cousin I hadn't seen in years. Each small step helped me remember that I had an identity beyond being a mother, that my life had value and purpose independent of David. A year had passed since that devastating day at Thompson's jewelry store. It was September of 2025. The monthly deposits continued to arrive regularly, $600 every 10th day. I was beginning to feel more emotionally stable, stronger, more confident in the decision I'd made. Then, on a typical Tuesday, my apartment doorbell rang without warning. I looked through the peephole and saw David. My first impulse was not to open the door. We'd had no contact beyond the monthly payments. But something compelled me to do so. David was different. Thinner, definitely. He looked tired, with bags under his eyes that indicated he hadn't been sleeping well. But there was something else, something in his posture, in the expression on his face. A humility I hadn't seen before. He asked if we could talk. I hesitated, but finally agreed. I let him in, but we didn't sit in the living room as usual. We stood in the doorway, maintaining a physical distance that reflected the emotional distance between us. David began by apologizing, but it was different from the apologies he had given a year earlier. They weren't empty excuses or justifications. They were words that seemed to come from a place of genuine reflection and repentance. He admitted that he had been a terrible son, that he had allowed himself to be carried away by superficial and materialistic values, that he had prioritized impressing others over honoring his family and his father's memory. He said that the last year had been extremely difficult, not only financially because of the monthly payments he was making, but emotionally as well. He said that a few months after I established the payment plan, Jessica had left him. The more modest financial lifestyle they'd been forced to adopt to pay off their debt to me wasn't acceptable to her. She wanted expensive dinners, designer clothes, and trips, and David could no longer afford those things while paying me $600 a month on top of his regular expenses. Jessica met someone through work, an executive with much more money, and simply broke up with David and left. She took with her much of the couple's possessions, including that damned Louis Vuitton bag that had caused so much trouble. David said the end of the marriage, though painful at the time, had been a blessing in disguise. He had finally seen Jessica for who she truly was and had seen himself through the reflection of this toxic relationship. He had become someone he didn't respect, someone his father would be ashamed to meet. In the months since the separation, he had done a lot of soul-searching and begun his own therapy. He was trying to rebuild his life based on real values, not superficial ones. I listened to it all in silence. Part of me wanted to hug him, console him for the separation, slip back into the comfortable role of protective mother I'd always been. But a wiser part of me, a part that had grown through the pain of the last year, knew I needed to be cautious. Words are cheap. Regret expressed after you've faced consequences isn't necessarily genuine. I needed to see real, consistent change over time. I told David I appreciated his coming, that I had heard what he said. But I made it clear that forgiveness wasn't something I could simply give right then and there. Trust is broken in a moment but takes years to rebuild, if it's ever completely rebuilt. He had hurt me deeply, betrayed my trust in ways I was still processing. His paying it forward was the absolute minimum he should do. It wasn't grounds for praise or automatic forgiveness. David said he completely understood, that he didn't expect immediate forgiveness. He just wanted me to know he was genuinely trying to change, that he was doing the necessary inner work, that he wanted to someday have some kind of relationship with me again, even if it would never be what it used to be. He also mentioned that now that he was alone and had fewer expenses, he could pay more each month to pay off the debt faster. He asked if I would accept monthly payments of $1,000 instead of $600. I said I would accept the larger payments if he could truly afford it without harming himself, but that it wouldn't change the timeline of our relationship. He agreed and said goodbye. I closed the door behind him and stood there for several long minutes, processing the visit. I wasn't sure I completely believed in this change in him. But I also recognized that people can change, and that perhaps the David who had visited me that day was the beginning of someone better than the man who had stolen his own father's ring. The following months established a new pattern. David began making occasional visits, always giving advance notice, always respecting the boundaries I set. The visits were short at first, perhaps 30 minutes, with only superficial conversations. He told me about his work, how he was learning to live alone and manage his own household without relying on anyone, and about the books he was reading. I noticed genuine changes. He never mentioned expensive brands or ostentation. He talked about learning to cook simple meals, about discovering pleasure in free things like walking in the park or visiting museums on free admission days. The monthly payments increased to $1,000 as he'd offered, arriving promptly every 10th day. With the larger payments, the debt was decreasing faster. I calculated that instead of 4 years to pay it off, it would take about 2.5 years if he kept up this pace. Each deposit that appeared in my account was a reminder of the betrayal, but also a symbol that he was keeping his word about at least this one thing. About 1.5 years after that initial visit, David finished paying off the entire debt. It had been 2 years and 3 months since the ring incident. That day had changed everything. When he made the final deposit, he called me and asked if we could meet for dinner. I hesitantly agreed. We met at a modest restaurant, the kind of place with good home-cooked food but no pretensions. During dinner, David handed me an envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, several pages of careful handwriting. I read it right there at the table, with David watching me nervously. The letter was a profound reflection on everything that had happened, on the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. He wrote about how he had come to understand that his value as a person came not from material things or the approval of others, but from integrity, honesty, and how you treat the people you love. He wrote about how he had spent months thinking about his father, about the kind of man Robert was, about the legacy Robert had left, and about how he had completely betrayed that legacy with his actions. The letter ended with David writing that while he couldn't change the past or undo the pain he had caused, he was committed to spending the rest of his life trying to be worthy of his father's memory and the love I had always given him. He didn't expect our relationship to return to what it was, but he hoped that with time and consistent action, we could build something new based on honesty and genuine respect. I cried reading that letter. They weren't just tears of pain or hurt, but a complex mix of emotions. Sadness for what we had lost, residual anger at the betrayal, but also, for the first time, a small shred of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe there was a chance for some kind of reconciliation, not by returning to what we were before, because that innocence had been lost forever, but by building something new. I told David I appreciated the letter, that I could see he'd done some real work to change. But I made it clear that we still needed time. That trust is rebuilt slowly, step by step. That I needed to see consistency over time before I could truly let my guard down. He understood and didn't pressure me. He simply thanked me for giving him the chance to at least try. Today, 3 years after that traumatic day at Thompson's Jewelry, my relationship with David is cautiously cordial. We see each other about once a month, usually for lunch or coffee. Our conversations are still a bit cautious, neither of us completely relaxed, but there are moments of genuine connection as well. David has never again asked for loans, nor even hinted at the need for financial help. I have never offered financial help again, maintaining very clear boundaries in this area. We exchange modest gifts for birthdays and Christmas, and we stay in touch through occasional text messages. The ring remains on my finger every day, a constant reminder not only of the love I shared with Robert, but also of the painful lessons I learned about boundaries, self-worth, and the true meaning of familial love. Sometimes I twirl it around my finger, thinking about everything that happened, how one piece of jewelry can symbolize so many different things. Love and betrayal, memory and pain, loss and, eventually, acceptance. I've learned a lot in these 3 years. I've learned that loving someone doesn't mean accepting mistreatment or exploitation. I've learned that being a mother doesn't mean being an inexhaustible resource with no right to boundaries or respect. I've learned that sometimes the truest love is the kind that establishes firm consequences for unacceptable behavior, even when those consequences hurt terribly. I've learned that I have value regardless of my usefulness to others. I've learned that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, to demand to be treated with dignity, to prioritize your own well-being. I've also learned that people can change, but only if they truly want to and do the necessary work. David seems to be doing that work. Whether his relationship with me will eventually become closer, warmer, more like what family should be, only time will tell. I don't have high expectations. I've protected my heart from further disappointment. But I keep a small door open to the possibility of rebuilding, because I believe people deserve a chance at redemption, as long as they demonstrate real change through consistent actions over time. If you identified with my story, know that you are not alone. Family financial abuse is much more common than we imagine. It happens silently because victims feel ashamed. They feel they must accept it because it's family. They feel that setting boundaries is cruel or selfish. But it's not. You have the right to be treated with respect and dignity, even by those you love unconditionally. You have the right to say no. You have the right to set boundaries and demand that they be respected. And you have the right to walk away, temporarily or permanently, from relationships that are toxic or harmful, even when those relationships are with family members. If you're in a similar situation, seek help. Talk to a therapist, consult a lawyer, talk to trusted friends. Document everything. Keep records of financial transactions, messages, and conversations. Don't be ashamed to admit you're being exploited. It's not your fault. And most importantly, always remember that you deserve better. You deserve to be loved in a way that doesn't require constant sacrifice. You deserve relationships based on mutual respect, not one-sided exploitation. Leave a like if this story touched you in any way, if it made you reflect on your own family relationships, or if it helped you feel less alone in your own experience. In the comments, tell me if you've ever been through something similar, how you dealt with the situation, or what you would do if you were in my shoes. Each shared story helps others understand that they are not alone, that these problems are more common than we imagine, and that it is possible to come out the other side stronger and more aware. Subscribe to the channel for more real stories like this. Stories that explore the complexities of family relationships, that speak to the difficult and less discussed aspects of family life, that offer not only entertainment but also reflection and perhaps comfort to those going through similar situations. This is a safe space for honest conversations about family, to acknowledge that it's not always perfect, and to learn that it's okay to set boundaries and prioritize your own well-being. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing this moment with me. And always remember, you matter, your happiness matters, and you deserve respect.